Okay, we're going to get back into After Effects. If you don't have it open, go ahead and open it up. And let's skip the welcome screen and just hit close on that. And I'm going to show you how to start a new composition. We'll go back and look at the welcome screen a little bit later. But as I kind of explained a little bit in the first video, After Effects is going to start out with your project. That's going to hold everything. And in your project, again, you can have multiple compositions. The compositions will be where we will create what will end up being the final video. This is where, as you build it, eventually we will render that out. Whatever the composition is, we'll render it out. And so again, you can have multiple compositions in one After Effects project. So what we're going to do is we're going to start a new composition. We're going to go up here to Composition, New Composition. And this is something that I want to really emphasize with After Effects is that the idea of compositing. And compositing is where we're going to bring a number of different elements together, visual and audio assets, media together, and build a final look, bringing in all types of, whether it's pictures, video, graphics, text. We're going to bring all that in together to create something that doesn't exist. And this will be built on layers. So the composition is where this all happens. Right now we're going to leave the composition at Comp 1. And a lot of times what we will do is, just so that the computer can handle it better, we'll start off with this HDTV 720 2997. I'll explain those numbers. The size of the video that we're going to complete will be 1280 by 720 pixels. Pixel is the smallest value that we're going to work with on screen. So going across the top from 0 left to right, it'll start off at 0 and it'll go to 1280 pixels. And then again, starting up in the upper left hand corner, the height will end up being from 0 down to 720 pixels. So that's our frame size, and this is your HDTV frame size. The next one up is 1080. We're not going to work with that right now, but that would be 1920 by 1080. So we need to make note of this and understand the raster size of the video that we're going to create. It'll be 1280 by 720, and this is one of the standards, 16 by 9 aspect ratio. This is one of the standards that you will work with. The next thing is the frame rate. How many frames per second? Right now it's 2997. That's a drop frame. I'm not going to worry about explaining that, but basically it's 30 frames per second. And this is your average TV that you watch your television shows. They will be at 2997. This is the common value for there. If we want to go to change that to film, we can do 24. We can either do 23976 or 24 frames. Just for fun right now, let's just change this to 24 frames because I like working with that. I like the look of it better. But we've changed the frame rate to 24 frames per second. And what that means is for every second of video, there are 24 frames. And that will be important because when we begin to keyframe, we will get down to these frames per second. And you need to know how many frames are per second, 24. So if we were going to do 2 seconds, that'd be 48. And you keep on going up. 3 seconds, 72 frames in that amount of time. And sometimes you have to calculate this out. So what would be half a second? It would be 12 frames. All right. And for the duration, let's just bring this down to it's set at 30. And it shows you 30 seconds on the base of 24 frames. And the way these numbers work is that these two, the first to the right, zeros, they represent your frames. So this would start at 0 and go up to 23. That would be 24 frames. And then here's the seconds where this 30 is. So this composition is set at 30 seconds. And then this next set of numbers would be your minutes. And then the last 0 down here would be your hours. So right now, let's change this, and we can highlight all of this and then just type in 1000, which will end up being 10 seconds, because 10 seconds and 0 frames there. So type in 1000 right there after you've highlighted it, and you'll be at 10 seconds. I recommend you never change this background color. Let's leave that at black, and then let's hit OK on that. So now we have our first composition. Of course, we've not created anything in it at this point, but this is our first composition. And you can see right here we have comp 1. This represents this timeline and this viewer right here in anything that we begin to add into it. So that is our first composition. We will be able to access this composition. We can add multiple compositions, as I've stated before. But this is the beginning of the composition, and you'll notice also it's highlighted here, and we get some information. It tells us like what we just set up, 1280 by 720, 10 seconds at 24 frames per second, and that is the important information. If we have audio in it, it'll also show that we end up having audio in it, but right now we don't, so that's not showing up. But that is where we can get some information on any asset media that we have in here. All right, let's look at adding our first object into the composition, and from there we will look at keyframing and how we create an animation. After Effects gives you some tools. You don't have to import everything, and in fact you can create an entire composition, motion media graphic, without using anything outside of After Effects. The way we're going to start this off is, let's make sure our timeline down here is selected. Let's go up to Layer, and we're going to see that we can add a number of different types of layer. The ones we'll look at right here at the beginning will be the top two. The rest we're not going to concern ourselves with at this point. But there's a text layer that we can add, and also a solid layer that we can add. Not going to worry about the text at this moment, but let's go ahead and add a new solid. It's going to open up a dialog box right here, and it's going to want you to tell it what type of layer you want to add, or the properties of that layer. For right now, so that we can see this layer, let's set the width and the height of that layer to 500 by 500. So just click in those boxes if they're set at something else, and type in 500, and then click on the next one, type in 500, and then come down here and choose whatever color you want. You can click on this, and you'll bring up the color picker, and we can choose whatever color we want there. So once you adjust this, you can click on the triangles here, move this up and down to get in the basic range of color you want, and then you can go over here into this area and slide around, click and drag around until you find the color you want, and it's going to represent right here, and pick you a color. Once you've found the color you want, just hit OK, and then let's hit OK down here, and now you should have a rectangle, or I'm sorry, a square in the composition based on whatever color you picked. Now, as I stated earlier, and did not mean to do that, what happened there was my viewer magnification changed. But as I stated earlier, the 1280 by 720 represents this here. We start at this 0 point right here in the upper left hand corner. That's your 0 point right there. And we have 1280 pixels that stretch across the top here. And then again, back over here in the left hand corner, we start at the 0 point, and we go from 0 down to 720 pixels. The reason I bring this up is I want to explain to you where this box is sitting right now. Because one of the things the thing that we do in After Effects is we work in time and we work in space. Those terms will show up in After Effects a lot of times as temporal, meaning time, or spatial, meaning space. And so this area deals mostly with the space factor. And I'm not talking about outer space, I'm just talking about this space right in here. In this black area, this is the area that we have to work with. This is our canvas. This is what's going to show up in our final video. And a lot of times we're going to need to know where our objects are in this space. And each object has what is called the anchor point. And for this object right here, it is this center right here. You can see that anchor point right there. Now, I'm going to go ahead and show you the 5 basic properties that we're going to animate with. So if we'll come down here, of course you can see, and let me go over this, you can see that we have the object here in the viewer, and then down here in the timeline we have the object also showing up. So this is the deep blue solid, this is the deep blue solid. They are the same thing, just represented visually here and then in time here. And as I mentioned in the first video also, you can see that we have our time indicated right here. We start at 0 seconds down here, and then we go up to 10 seconds here. And we will zoom in on this a little bit later to see the individual frames. But for right now, let's just note that we go from 0 to 10 seconds, and that's how we set up the composition. All right, so back to the properties that we're going to animate. Come over here to the far left, and you'll see this triangle right here. We want to scroll it open, and from there we have what is called the transform properties. Now nothing's showing up at this point. We have yet another triangle that we need to open up. So let's scroll that open, and now we've gotten to our 5 basic properties that we're going to animate. This is where we'll go over these properties, but this is where we'll do our animation. Now I was talking about the anchor point. That anchor point is right there, and you'll see right here we have the term anchor point, and next to that we have 2 numbers. These 2 numbers are going to represent what we will always refer to as X, which is along your horizontal X axis, our X value, which goes along the horizontal line. Anywhere horizontally along here is going to be our X value. And then Y, X and Y. Y will be our vertical value, where we go from top to bottom, and or bottom to top. That's going to be our vertical value. So these 2 numbers represent X and Y. Now they're set at 250 by 250, and if you'll remember, the size of our box, the size of our square here, is 500 pixels by 500 pixels. So the center point of this square is 250 by 250. So if you come over 250 pixels and then come down 250 pixels, that's where that anchor point is. That's the anchor point of this object. Now After Effects, for the most part, is always going to try to put your anchor point in the center of whatever the media is. So keep that in mind, and you can always locate it. This value is representative of the size of the object. Okay, so this could be 700 by 700 rather than 500 by 500, and our anchor point would be set at 350 by 350. So that anchor point always represents the center of the object, or what After Effects is saying is the center of the object. This point can be moved around, but for right now we're not going to worry about that. We don't want to really mess with the anchor point at this point. We want to leave it, but we do want to understand it, understand what it represents. Now, the position is based on the anchor point. This position right here is telling me where this anchor point is. Okay, so this position value right here, 640 by 360, is telling me where that anchor point is in the composition. This can be a little confusing, but I want to try to differentiate these 2. the position is telling me where the anchor point is in the composition. The anchor point on the actual layer is telling me where the anchor point is for that object. Okay. So the position is at 640 pixels, starting from over here, going to the right, 640 pixels, and then we come down 360 pixels. So that's where the object is in the composition, in the viewer. Okay. So we can move that around, and when we move that around, we're going to move the object around in the composition. So we can scrub that, click on that number and scrub, and you can see that it's moving the object. And what it is doing is moving that object based on that position right there, that anchor point. All right, I'm going to Command Z that, get me back to where I am centered. And of course you can see that those numbers do represent the center point of this composition. Remember that the composition is 1280 by 720. So the center point of the composition would be half of that, which is 640 by 360. And that is where that object is sitting. All right. Now scale means the size of this object, and rather than changing the number of pixels that are in it, we can scale it, the size of it. You can scale this up and you can scale it down, and it can go into a negative number also, so just keep that in mind. But if we want it completely out, we can type in 0, scale it down to 0%, and then if we want it back to its original size, we can type in 100%, and we are back at the original size of the object. And the scale is based on this anchor point. You can see that when we scale it down, it scales into that anchor point, or it scales out from that anchor point. So that anchor point is very important to understand it. The rotation also works on the anchor point. So we can rotate this, and these two numbers do represent two different things. The first thing we're going to look at is, so it's 0x by 0 degrees. So right now this has been rotated 0 degrees. And when we rotate an object, we can rotate it 360 degrees, and we complete a full rotation. So when we rotate this, it will rotate around that anchor point. So we can click in here in the degrees, click and start dragging to the right, and you can see that it is rotating around that anchor point. And then pay attention to the number that we're set at. So we're at 260. We keep going on up. When we get up to 360, notice what the first number does. So now we've completed one full rotation, and we can keep going, and we can do 2 full rotations. All right. Now you don't have to rotate that constantly to get the number of rotations that you want to use. This comes in when we begin to animate. But if we want to do, say, 3 rotations in an animation of this, all we would have to do is set our first keyframe at 0, and then our second keyframe at 3, and it would say, and then it would animate that 3 full rotations in the amount of time we have set down here. So that's the difference between those two numbers. Rather than scrubbing this up and trying to get it around 3 times, we can just type in the number 3 and it will rotate. And the final property here is opacity. And opacity deals with how much you see of the object, or rather see through the object, and how much you don't see through the object. Right now it's 100% opaque, and opaque means that we fully see it. Okay, transparency is the other word. Transparent means that we see through it. Okay, so we will use those terms interchangeably, but opaque means that we see it, and transparent means that we begin to see through it. So we're at 100% opacity, 100% viewable. When we start to drag this down, it begins to fade out, and we can see through it, and we'll demonstrate this a little bit more later, but right now what you're seeing is it's basically disappearing and becoming transparent. So down to 0 visibility, you cannot see the object any longer. If we were to have another object behind it, you would be able to see through it. But that is your opacity there. All right, now all of these properties can be animated. And we're going to start with a simple animation. We'll just animate the position. I'm going to tell you, remind you of this. Leave the anchor point alone for right now. Make sure that you are not moving this object with the anchor point. That will start to cause a lot of confusion. The anchor point, there's going to be a few times you will use this, but for the most part, you'll leave that anchor point alone. The position is going to actually move the object in the composition. Let's talk about keyframes. Keyframe, and we'll demonstrate this in a minute, but a keyframe is a point in time that we record the properties of that value, or we record that property. And so what we're going to do is we're going to set a keyframe on the position. And what we'll do is basically just animate this box sliding out. We're at the starting point for this composition. Knowing that I'm going to set up some other things in a few minutes, I want to jump into the timeline to 1 second. And the way we navigate through this timeline is going to be this timeline indicator right here. This timeline indicator will show you where we are in the timeline, and it will also help us set keyframes. So you can see 0 seconds right there, 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds, 4 seconds, 5 seconds, on up. You can also find this value represented here. Now remember that the project that we set up, there's 24 frames in that second. So if we scrub through this, you can see we're at 23 frames. So we're almost at a full second. We move it just slightly to the right, and there we are at 1 second. So we have 0, and you can watch that number move on up to 24 frames, or first second right there. So we're a second into the composition. So the player, and the way you get this to play is by hitting the space bar, and you can see that that timeline indicator moving across the screen right now. We've not done any animation, so nothing's happening, but you can see that it's moving. All right, hit the space bar again. That stops it. So let's go and set this again at 1 second. Now to set a keyframe on any property, you'll notice right next to these properties, and any property that can be animated will have a stopwatch right next to it. And this is what this image is the stopwatch. At this point, we have not set a keyframe, but we're going to here at the position. So let's click on that stopwatch, and a couple of things have happened at this point. Number one, we indicate that we have set a keyframe right there, and that's fine. But where we really want to see it is in the timeline over here. So now at 1 second, we have set a keyframe. We've recorded these properties for position of this layer of the blue solid. So that's the first keyframe. Now, the thing about this is any animation, for the most part, there may be reasons why on some others, but for the most part, any animation you do is going to need at least 2 keyframes. Any animation that you create is going to need at least 2 keyframes. The first beginning keyframe and then an ending keyframe. So we've set our first keyframe. Now we need to move in time to set our second keyframe, because any animation is going to involve time and space. It's going to move over time, and it's going to move in space, in position, or rotate, or the opacity is going to change. There has to be some type of physical change. There's going to be a time lapse. There's going to be from the beginning of it to the end of it, there's going to be time, and then there's also going to be a physical change. So we need to make those two things happen. So we need to move our timeline indicator, and we can go to about 2 seconds, somewhere in there. And let's just simply click on the X value, which is the 640, and drag it to the right. And what that's going to do is drag the object to the right. So we click, drag, Let's drag it on off of the screen. And that's what you're going to end up seeing when you watch this animation. If you'll notice a couple of things, we have set physically a physical point here that the object was, and now off screen we have another point that the object is sitting at now. You have a keyframe here. This keyframe represents this point, so we have it represented in time, and we have it represented physically in space. And then also this other keyframe, and I'm going to grab the hand tool to move this over so you can see it. And all I've done is move the canvas. I haven't done any animation there. I've just moved the canvas is all I've done. But your other keyframe is sitting right there. And that is the animation we've created. So now we can drag back. Let me get my my canvas back into view here. And we're at the drag back to the beginning of the composition and hit your space bar and watch your animation. And you can see as we click and drag here, you can see what happens in time, and you can also see here in the viewer what's happening in space. Now this path here, and that's what it's called, is a path, represents the number of frames that it takes to do this animation. Each one of these little dots represents a frame, and I'm going to zoom in on this timeline here. All I'm doing is just zooming in on it, getting closer in between this 1 second and this 2 second mark. And you'll see that we now start representing those frames. There's 1 frame, there's 2 frames, 3, 4, 5, and on up. And we get to the other keyframe right there. And we're at 21, 22, 23, and then it starts over at our second position, our 2 second position right there, and that's that keyframe right there. So I'm going to zoom back out to see my full timeline here, and again, there is our animation. So for any animation, it takes 2 keyframes to make it work. So let's add a little bit more to this. We're going to go to scale, and what I'll do here is go back to the 1 second mark in the timeline, and let's set a keyframe, and we're at 100% here. And let's scale this down as it goes out. So we'll let it come to its final resting position out off of the screen, and then let's just scale that down to 0. You can type in one of those and scale it down to 0. And let's watch our animation. So as it goes out, it scales down. Go back to the beginning, watch that again. Okay, so just with these 2 properties, we've already created this animation here. Very simple. 4 keyframes is all it's taken so far. We've animated 2 properties. So let's go back to the beginning of the timeline, and let's work with our opacity. And what we want to do is we want to make this fade up. So let's set this first keyframe at the very beginning of the timeline. Set that keyframe for opacity. And let's click in here and just type 0. It's going to make it disappear. And so we've set that first keyframe here at 0 position in the timeline. Let's move up to 1 second. And let's click on that 0% for opacity. Click on it and drag to the right, and you can go to 100%, or you can just click on it and type in 100, enter. And we've set that second keyframe. So the way keyframing works is you will always need to set that first keyframe by hitting the stopwatch, and then when you move in the timeline and you adjust the property, it will change, or it will add the second keyframe for you. And from there on out, if I wanted to add more keyframes for this opacity property, all I would need to do is move it in time and then adjust the property, and it will add another keyframe. Now I don't want that keyframe there, so I'm just going to select it and delete it. But at this point, we've added to our animation, And let's see what we've got. So go back to the beginning of the timeline, hit your space bar, and you'll see that then the rectangle fades in and then begins to move. All right. Let's do one last to animate the rotation, just so we can animate these 4. Again, not going to really worry about the anchor point. We'll look at that later. But I guess since we have 2 animations on the way out, let's do 2 animations on the way in. So let's rotate this one time as it fades in. So we want to set a keyframe for the rotation the way we set that first keyframe. Make sure our timeline indicator is where it needs to be. And then go to rotation, set that rotation stopwatch there. We've set that first keyframe, end it, about 1 second. And if we want to do one full rotation, we could drag this around to 360 if we wanted to, or we can click right here and type in 1, and that's going to do 1 full rotation. So let's go back to the beginning of the timeline, hit your space bar, let it render out, and then it'll play and show us. So let's go back to the beginning of the timeline, hit play. So as it fades up, it rotates in and then it moves out. So this is the beginning of animating in After Effects using these keyframes. Remember that it's always going to take 2 keyframes to create an animation, at least 2 keyframes. We can add more after that, but you need 2 keyframes to create an animation. The way to start off to set a keyframe is to start with the stopwatch next to the property that you want to animate. You'll always need to move in time to set, even if it's 1 keyframe, or I'm sorry, 1 frame, even if it's only 1 frame, you need to move in time to set the next keyframe so that you have a full animation. So it's always going to take 2 keyframes to do that, and our 5 basic properties will be anchor point, position, scale, and rotation.